Sound check 1, 2, 3, 4.
Good evening. My name is Cameron Sanchez. I'm a reporter with KJZZ News in Tempe, and I will be the moderator for our debate this evening. The Citizens Clean Elections Commission is the sponsor of this event. As the state's voter education agency, Clean Elections is the official sponsor of Arizona debates, so that voters have the opportunity to hear directly from candidates, ask questions on the issues that matter most to them, and vote informed. Voters watching this debate live, you can submit a question at any time through email at debates@kc-a.com, text 408-302-1810, or by phone at 480-937-1253. We may not get to all of the audience questions, but we will do our best. Tonight, we're hearing from candidates in Legislative District 15, which covers parts of Queen Creek, Santan Valley, a little bit of Maricopa County, a little bit of Pinal County. As this is a primary election debate, candidates are competing against others in their party to become the official party nominee. All registered voters, including independent voters, can vote in the primary. Independent voters can choose a single party ballot they wish to vote. We will kick off the evening by hearing first from the candidates in the House. They will debate for approximately an hour. Only the candidates currently debating will appear with their cameras and microphones on. Candidates, you will have 1 minute for your opening and closing statements, and 2 minutes for your responses to voter questions. We encourage an open exchange of dialogue between opponents. If you feel the need to respond to another candidate's comments after they conclude speaking, you may do so. I may limit responses for time management purposes, and we remind the candidates and the audience that this is a respectful, courteous, and professional environment. Our goal tonight is to connect candidates and voters so that the electorate may vote informed. So the candidates we have running for State House of Representatives are Republicans Neil Carter and Alex Stovall. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yes?
Yes.
Great. And the other candidates who were invited but did not participate are Michael Way and Peter Anello. So the order in which we're going to start off is with Representative Carter first and Mr. Stovall going next, and then we'll do the closing comments in reverse order. So Representative Carter, you have 1 minute whenever you're ready.
Thank you. I just want to thank you for hosting this as usual. Thank you for everyone for joining us. My name is Neil Carter. I'm currently serving in the House for the last 3 years for District 15. I'm proud to say that in my time, we have run the state as fiscally as responsible as we can. We're running a lean Arizona and trying to reply to the real concerns of Arizona's families. Last year, for example, we passed a budget with my support that reduced spending by 1.6%. In the context of inflation, that would be a much higher number, but in real dollar terms, we're shrinking your budget. I submitted a bill to eliminate the tax on rents in Arizona, which is, of course, rent is not a luxury. So we're trying to help working people to afford their rent. I'm glad to say that the rental tax in Arizona is no longer allowed. We also, as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, we've heard bills to eliminate the tax on groceries and other regressive taxes. So we know that in this time of unprecedented inflation, one of the ways we can help Arizona families is by reducing costs and running as lean a state as we can. We've done all of that in the context of increasing funding for education by 6.9% last year, 2.9% of that ongoing, so year after year, increases in education funding. So we're trying to run a lean state, but still maintain the priorities that our communities are telling us are important to Arizonans in terms of things like security, police, fire, and schools, and cut the fat where we can and return some money to the voters. So if that's the kind of thing that you like, if you like that kind of fiscal responsibility and that kind of management, I would encourage you to vote for Neil Carter.
All right, thank you. That was a little closer to 2 minutes. So Mr. Stovall, I'll take some extra time. No, that's all right. Go ahead.
No worries. Yes. My name is Alex Stovall. I'm running an LD15. I grew up in this district. I went to school in this district. I've spent a lot of time in the community. I myself am also really focused on balancing the budget and getting this debt under control. I'm into building bridges, not burning them, and asking for a yacht. I believe that there are a lot of young leaders in our community that haven't been heard, and I'm wanting to be an advocate for the leaders in the community and the leaders that are actively in the community. I've spent a lot of my time in school. My background is military and logistics, so I understand numbers and how important numbers are in the community. So getting our budget balanced and helping voters understand the importance of getting involved and being advocates for themselves is something that I'm really putting a focus on in the upcoming election. And I look forward to serving you guys. It would be an honor and a privilege. Thank you.
Well, that was almost exactly 1 minute. So the first question I have here from voters is a popular question from the last election too. And it is, who won the 2020 presidential election in Arizona? Mr. Stovall, we can start with you this time.
Well, we see that the information that was shared with us, I wasn't personally counting the ballots. Unfortunately, I was gone with the military, but the results are what the results are. I believe that there was a lot of fraud and fishiness going on in the election. And I think there needs to be some accountability moving forward. And I'm willing to be that advocate and willing to be that fighter to ensure that we get the results that the voters deserve and that the voters believe we had in the previous election. So that's what I'll say about that.
Is Joe Biden duly elected?
From what we see in the numbers and what we see in the previous election, that's what we're showing. Until we see something more with more solidified facts, I think that's kind of where we have to stand. He's currently the president. We know a lot of fishiness went on with the election. We know that there was a lot of lack of accountability and some things took place that really shouldn't have taken place. But I think what we should be focused on is ensuring that no fraud and no fishiness happens in the upcoming election.
All right, Representative Carter, same question.
I'm glad you asked. I've been an observer, a poll observer since 2008. So that's long before it was popular or something that's been in the mainstream media in terms of the last election. I live in Pinal County, so I live in the Pinal County part of the district. And I can tell you that in 2016, I was poll watching and I sent a letter to the then recorder, Virginia Ross, about 30 violations that I had found then. I also watched the count in 2018. I did the count verification that we do following the machine count, as you may know, as well in 2018. And I've been observing the elections for a long, long time. I can tell you that in 2020, I watched Pinal County in Coolidge. That's where the counting takes place, since the recorder building in Florence actually burned down a couple of years ago. But so in Coolidge, I was there until almost midnight on election night, scan the ballots in. I have a good deal of faith in Dana Lewis and in the current Pinal County people. I can tell you with my own eyes, I watched the ballots being scanned and that it didn't look like there was funny business in Pinal in 2020. Maricopa is another story. I think Maricopa has a lot of problems. They don't do precinct-based voting, which means that there's a higher potential for fraud because the numbers are greater and you are more easily able to fudge them. I would like to see a return to precinct-only based voting. There's a lot of things like this. We did have a significant win in the legislature this year. If I'm going over the time, please stop me. I'm sorry. I don't have a timer.
You actually haven't yet. Go ahead.
Okay. We did pass and have signed into law over the last year, your legislature, signature verification bill, which is very important because prior to that, we had no way of verifying that the people who were submitting the ballots really that their signatures really matched, and that wasn't a public record. That's one of the things that's been a problem in the Kerry Lake cases and some of the other cases in terms of access to those records. So we're making progress as we can, and it's very important. I mean, very important.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask the same follow-up question, which is, despite what you say is a possibility for fraud in Maricopa County, do you believe that President Biden was duly elected?
I think in Pinal County, the numbers are fine. I'm not sure about Maricopa. I'm concerned because on election night, there were 5 states that were using Dominion software that all stopped counting at the same second, and the same, like 5 states all stopped counting the same minute. That really looks fishy to me. But like Mr. Stovall said, he has been the president now 4 years and it's an election year. So at this point, our best bet is to defeat him at the ballot box, I think, because we're not going to be able to relitigate that election now that the 4 years are over.
I have a question coming in live that I've never seen asked before. What are your thoughts on the fence around the Arizona Capitol? Does it separate the people from their government? And this time we'll start with Representative Carter.
I'm against the fence, actually, for a number of reasons. Primarily because it costs money. And I would like to see it saved. And we've not had a fence for a long time. My background, my sort of university and educational background is in classics and literature. And I can remember a classical Latin piece where a poet had asked the emperor, "What are you doing that you need all this security?" Right? What are we doing that we need to have a fence around us? You know, we really shouldn't be up to that kind of evil that requires some sort of protection or separation between us and the people. It's my point of view. That was a decision that was made by the Capitol groundskeeping people. For example, Legislative Council runs the museum, and also the Speaker and President to some extent. And it was in response to the rioting, for lack of a better word, the rioting, and you can watch the palm tree on fire from tear gas. I mean, while we were passing a budget in 2021, following the Roe versus Wade decision. So it was a decision that was made. I will hasten to point out it's really only a fence around the parking lot. So they haven't fenced off the Capitol really, but I'm still against it. But I think some of the members were afraid for their safety, probably people chasing them to their cars and things. I don't know. Like I say, I'm against it. It wasn't my decision, but it's there, and it doesn't actually fence off the whole Capitol. So
All right.
at least there's
Great.
that.
Strong anti-fence sentiment, Mr. Stovall.
I'm against it. I think that we work, I believe, and I know we work for the people, and putting up a fence almost puts up a wall between us and open communication. I pride myself in being transparent with the community. I don't really see the need for the fence. I mean, it's great to have a fence around the parking lot. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not elected, so I don't know what the conversation was in the chamber. But what I will say is putting up fences is not a good look, especially as leaders in the community. So it's going to be a hard no for me.
Distinct anti-fence sentiment. I'm not a huge fan of the fence myself. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. The next question here coming from constituents is on abortion. What are your views on abortion? I'll expand it a little further. Do you support the law that we have on the books, the 15-week ban, the older ban that's more comprehensive, or some alternative? Mr. Stovall, you can start off.
I think we need to find some common ground. I'm not really happy with where we're at with the abortion bill. I'm exclusively pro-life, but I'm also not a woman. So I think there needs to be transparency with the discussions that are being had within the chamber. And it's ultimately up to the voters in the community what they want us to do. I mean, I know what I believe and where I stand and where my convictions are, but I do think we need some serious movement and improvement on that bill.
Would you have voted in favor or against the repeal measure, the repeal of the what's called the territorial era abortion ban that recently passed?
I didn't look at all the legislation in its entirety, so I can't give you an exact answer. I'd have to go back and look at all the legislation in its entirety. I'm sure there was some pork in there and some things that probably had no business being in the legislation. And that's one of the things I intend to do upon my election. Ensure that all of the bills are being read in its entirety. So I can't give you a solidified response with that. I'd have to go back and look at the bill and look at all of it, and then I can give you a more solidified answer.
All right, thank you. Mr. Carter, I know your vote on the bill, but tell me about your view on abortion. Do you support the law we have?
My view on abortion has always been very clear and unequivocal. I believe in the sanctity of human life from conception to natural death. And if you believe in that, then I'm your candidate. If you don't, then I'm not. And I would rather lose an election than compromise on my values. So as you say, you know what my vote is. You might say I have a hard line stance on that, and if that's not what you want, then I'm not your guy, because that's how I feel and that's how I'm going to vote, and I'm not really open for compromise on that.
All right. I think the next thing I want to get to is another hot button topic I've heard we might be addressing this week at the legislature, which is border security. And that's been, I think, something the voters are very interested in this year. There was an effort by some Republican lawmakers to pass a bill similar to one in Texas that would make it a state crime to cross the border outside of a port of entry. That was vetoed, and now there's talk of sending that to the ballot. Is that something you believe is important? Why? Is that the state's job, or is it the federal government's job to handle border security? Back to you, Representative Carter.
So again, to go back to sort of the classical education, my view is that the government is at its high watermark in terms of appropriate government function. As a conservative, the most appropriate government function is security, securing borders, repelling invaders, arresting murderers. That's the classical government function that we should be doing. The federal government has abdicated on the border. It's clear. We've done what we can. I'm proud to say that in last year's budget, which I voted for, we were able to preserve the funding for the Border Strike Force. Sheriff Lamb, my sheriff, came to us and asked for funding for a high-powered drone project whereby he can track traffickers from the air on I-8 and 10, which cross Pinal. We funded that, so we've done everything we can. Yes, there was a bill that you referred to. It was a Representative Chaplik bill, which I believe passed and was vetoed, if I remember correctly. And so the idea now is to bring it directly to the people and make it, the people get to decide. Ultimately, it's the people's will that's supposed to govern. We're in representative democracy, so you elect one of us, and we, I guess, are your mouthpiece. But we can go directly to you if we want to, and if that's something that people will want, then we'll have that. If it's something that people won't want, then we won't have that. But yes, that is something that is being considered right now.
All right, back to you, Mr. Stovall.
I believe the border is a federal issue. So I think there are things that the state legislator can do. As Representative Carter mentioned, there was a bill that was vetoed. I'd like to work with my colleagues in the future to try and see if we can get that bill pushed through. There are things we can do to ensure that we have a safe and secure border, but it really falls in the federal government's hands of how they want to pursue that, and it's whatever the voters want.
I see a question here now about education. What do you do to improve the funding of public schools? I think you could also just say if you believe that public schools are already being funded enough. Representative Carter, I'll start off with you on education funding.
Sure. Education funding is a complicated beast. There's monies that come from state trust. There's monies we appropriate. There's other monies that come from the feds and so on. There's a lot, I think, of misinformation around it. One thing is that more than half of the state's budget goes to education. Not quite half if you're only looking at K through 12. Like I said, we have increased the funding for education year over year, every single year, I believe over 10 years. I've only been there 3 years. I know that we've increased education funding every single year. I know that we increased the funding for public schools specifically, because sometimes politicians sort of play with that, education versus public schools or charters and other things, ESAs. We increased the funding for public schools specifically, like I say, last year by 6.9%, and that in the context of a shrinking budget, which I really think speaks to our priorities and ongoing. So another kind of thing that I think a lot of people are sort of unaware of, that you have one-time money that you appropriate this year or next year or the third year, and then you have funding formulas that are ongoing. So every year that formula per student is allocated. So we increased the ongoing funding by 2.9%, and then additionally put another 4% of funding toward public education last year. So 6.9% increase in public education funding. I'm a product of public schools. I went to public schools through college, graduated from university. My wife graduated from Gilbert High School and ASU. I certainly, as Americans, I think we support education, but we also support freedom and we support choice. And if you want to educate your child, the government doesn't raise your child, parents do. So if you want to send your child to another kind of a school, that should be your right. And I fully support that as well. I voted in support of that. So I do think there's a middle ground here. I know there's a bit of a debate between should we do one or the other. The reality is we can fund public schools and fund ESAs and get along and have a free system with healthy public schools. And we have been, I think. We even blew through the constitutional spending cap for 2 of the last 3 years, possibly blowing through it this year. But so we're literally fully funding education. We're funding it as much as the Constitution allows us to, and then even more by overriding that. So, those are facts. I'm happy to talk to anybody more at greater length about that one-on-one if people want to talk about that. But I guess that's how I feel.
All right, Mr. Stovall, same question to you, which was, how are you in public education? And I think maybe, do you think it's already being funded enough? And then if you wanted to talk a little about your stance on ESAs, since Representative Carter did, feel free to go on for a little bit more than 2 minutes.
I think we're of the same mind with that. I'm in support of school choice and ESAs. I will say that I went to 7 public high schools, so I'm very familiar with the curriculum and the importance of public schools. It did a lot for me in my life growing up, but I also am very familiar with private schools. I actually finished my high school diploma in a private school. So I believe that you can have both, and there is a way to do that. It's just having the discussions and informing the voters and ensuring them that we are going to be their mouthpiece when we get there, or if we're already there, rather. But I also think it's important to let them know they've got to advocate for themselves and let us know what it is that they want, so we can go fight and push for that. But I'm in favor. Ultimately, I'm all for school choice.
All right. I'm going to ask about water now. Water conservation is something that voters care about a lot. It's also something that in the legislature has been a priority, at least in the last few years. What can we do to protect our water resources, and what's the next step for water conservation? Mr. Stovall, if you'd like to start off.
I think there's a couple of things we can do, and I've kind of been in discussion with people of some things that we can do to conserve water, gray water, well water, and other water avenues. I don't think it's impacting Pinal County too much just yet. And I think that the direction we're headed is good from the discussions and the talks that I've heard from other legislators at the Capitol. But I do think we need to address it sooner than later, maybe getting desalinization plants, possibly figuring out a more cost-effective way rather than shipping water. We've got to be self-sufficient and rely on our own resources for that. So I think there's ways to do it. I think that there are discussions that are being had, and I think it's definitely something possible to move in the right direction and actually conserve water in a safe way.
Okay. Mr. Carter?
Yes, absolutely. Water is huge. So a couple of things. One thing that I find in talking to voters is there's definitely concern for water. Arizona is doing a good job of conservation, though. We use less water today than we did in 1980, and we have a way larger population. So we are doing a lot of conservation. There comes a point, though, where you have to bring in new water resources. There's only so many times that you can fold the paper, until you can't fold it anymore. So I believe that we need to be looking at bigger solutions. In the 80s, when the Central Arizona Project Canal was instituted, was built, and of course been fully functional for decades now, that was a huge leap forward generationally for water, and we need to be looking at things like that now. So in terms of conservation, yes, we're doing a lot of that. For example, the city of, I guess it's the town of Gilbert is recycling their gray water, so the effluent. That's something that Queen Creek looks at, and it's something that is going on. So there's definitely conservation that's a part of that, and that is happening, and conversations around that. We're also trying to be more responsible with who uses our water. The legislature had looked at the Fondo Monte problem, where we have sort of foreign companies coming in, pumping without limits. The governor ultimately had pulled their lease on that. So just trying to be responsible with the effluent, recycling it, with who's using the water, certainly for conservation. But to be fair, we're doing pretty good with conservation. So we need to be looking at new sources. 3 years ago, the legislature was looking at creating a water authority and funding it with $1 billion. There's a lot of money. It's some real teeth, so that they could look at actual long-term, like a pipeline from somewhere, a desalinization plant, something that would be a public-private partnership that would, an entity that would have contract authority and real funding behind it to bring in new water sources. That did pass, and the first third of it was funded 2 years ago, and another, I think, 200 million or something last year. No, I'm a fiscal conservative. I don't believe in spending money and just throwing money at a problem that's stupid. But we were able to bake into that legislative oversight. So There are two legislative members overseeing that on the board of that, and so we're able to make sure that monies are appropriately funded and that we'll really get new real sources of water, new wet water coming into our state, maybe 20 or 30 years from now, but we have to lay the groundwork for that now. So
sounds like we're headed in the right direction from what you're saying with the desalinization plants.
I think so.
And Mr. Stovall, if you wanted to elaborate more, I was going to say that was a little over on water. So if there's anything you wanted to elaborate on, feel free.
No, I appreciate that. No, once again, I think we're in the same mindset with that, making sure we're planning for the future. Our conservation, our plans for that seem pretty good. I'm not elected, so I don't get to sit in on those meetings quite yet. But from what I do know and from what Representative Carter is saying, it seems like we're in the right direction. I think we just need to add some pressure and really get the people in the community advocating for that as well, so we can really get a push at the legislature for that.
It's interesting that you both mentioned desal. It's not something I've heard much about recently. So housing. This is, I think, probably the kitchen table issue we hear about most often. Yes, literally kitchen table. I'm very curious to know, what are your thoughts on affordable housing? How do we get more of that? How do we make that accessible to the constituents? And is this also a priority in your district? And Mr. Stovall, if you want to start off.
Absolutely. I'm currently feeling the pressure and the squeeze of that. My rent is like $2,500 a month. It is expensive. Housing is going to continue to be an issue with this record inflation that we're dealing with and this environment that we're dealing with. I think it's important that the legislators can try and ensure they're going to do everything that they possibly can in the upcoming election to try and lower the cost of living. It's becoming ridiculous. I mean, you're now having to choose between feeding your family or paying your electric bill. I myself come from a dysfunctional background where my family had to make decisions like that. So it's something that's very personal and near and dear to my heart, and something that I'm going to be really focused on upon my election. Just lowering the cost of living, I think, there's some things that need to be hashed out, I'm sure, working with our colleagues at the legislature, but I do think that should be of the utmost importance moving forward as our community grows.
It's a topic that's been the subject of a lot of strife in the legislature. I'll follow up with you just quickly and ask, any specifics about how you want to go about creating more affordable housing.
I won't go into specifics, but I have some ideas that I think will work really well.
Representative Carter.
It's a great topic. The government is not directly involved, but is indirectly involved, and I'll get to that in the cost of some things. But where we are directly involved is in taxation and in getting into your pocket to pay for the state's functions. And like I said in the opening comments, I'm proud to say that I drafted and submitted a bill to eliminate the tax on rent. In my mind, that is the terrible kind of a tax to have. It's very regressive. It hits the poorest among us. It's an essential item, a living space. It's not like a luxury tax or something. And I'm glad to say that today it is illegal for cities and towns to charge tax on your rent. So that's one place where we have a literal impact, a direct impact, and that we have delivered on that. But I also think that Americans will solve problems if the government gets out of the way. And one of the problems that we're facing is we've had inexpensive housing in Arizona, in our district particularly. It's one reason I moved here. I moved to Pinal County, Santan Valley area about 15 years ago from Gilbert, because I couldn't afford Gilbert and I could afford here, and you just kind of move farther out. And so I know that the housing industry can provide inexpensive housing. Part of the problem is that the permitting takes years sometimes for cities and counties to approve things. And so we have drafted bills to the legislature that said, look, you need to make a decision on a permit within a certain number of days, and that's it. If you don't, then they have the right to move forward in spite of your dilly-dallying. So we are looking at that, because remember, the cost borne by home builders is a lot of times the financing, it's the interest on their investment building the houses. So we're trying to get cities and towns to move faster on that. Another element of the problem that you mentioned before is water. That's one thing we're working on. But a big problem too in our state is that we have the sufficient resources. We have the land to develop housing, but a lot of it is owned by the government. A lot of it's federal land. Something like 85% of the state is federal, between Forest Service, BLM, Bureau of Land Management, and other things. And so that's a big problem too. I think we need to take back control of a lot of our own land. And with those three things, we'd go a long way to lowering the cost of housing, I think, overall.
Did the rental tax go into effect yet, or is that January that happens? The elimination of the rental tax.
It's a good question.
I can't. I thought it hadn't, but
feel-
I'm doubting myself.
I feel like it had. It was from last session, and normally the law goes into effect 90 days after the end of session. But I think that we gave a time period to the cities and towns to adjust their own budgets.
Right.
And yeah, so I
We
can
can
look that up. Yeah.
We can move on, but I'll be talking to my apartment complex after this. I'm just curious now. So I have a question coming in live. It says, it seems as if Arizona lacks a police presence on major highways. Do you think Arizona is facing recruitment problems? And how can the police force stop fatal car accidents from happening? Why don't we just continue with you for now, Representative Carter?
Sure. I do think that there is a shortage in hiring. I think that that's probably across the board, but it's also acutely felt in what I'll call public safety careers, not just DPS or highway patrol, but also I volunteer in the prison. I with my church. I go in there, and they have severe shortages of personnel, including nurses and things too. So there's definitely a problem. We have increased the pay scale of DPS by 20% over the last couple of years, and of a lot of the other agencies and things like the Department of Corrections personnel and so on. So we know that there's recruitment and retention problems, and we have been handling that. We are also fiscally conservative. Like I say, we have to prioritize things like border security, education, police, and still shrink the budget on the wasteful stuff. So I'm glad to say that even though we've given raises to our DPS, we've still managed to shrink the budget by 1.5 points last year. So we're trying to address that problem. It was kind of a two-part question though. Yes, I think there's recruitment problems. Yes, I think we're trying to address it. I'm the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee too, and we have one of the best pension systems in the states because we're fully funded. So we're not like California or these places where you hear the horror stories that it's like this huge hole of money, which is another good thing. So this is actually a pretty good state to live in because we're pretty well managed. Now, how do we get people to stop having accidents? So that's harder, right? I mean, I think some people drive terribly, but that's a tough one. But it's funny, I was talking to my brothers about this recently. I think a lot of people don't want to become policemen because it seems like culturally there is a lack of respect, but we're doing what we can. We also had a bill to prohibit defunding of police as well, circulating through the legislature. I don't remember the status of that now, but I'm open to suggestions. I'm all ears. Email me. Tell me what you want me to do to fix the problem, because I agree.
All right, Mr. Sobel, same question. I'll give you a refresher because it's a long one. It seems as if the state lacks a police presence on major highways. Are we facing recruitment problems, and how do we stop fatal car accidents from happening in Arizona?
We are facing recruitment problems. I spoke to a police officer, I want to say maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, and I believe the numbers could be higher. They may be a little bit lower now with the recruitment kind of on the uptrend, but I think it's 6,800 people per officer, and that's from all 3 shifts. So there's a significant shortage in police officers. I'm all in support of recruiting police officers and beefing up our police. In regards to the other portion of that question, maybe having more speed cameras. I mean, that you can't really, I feel like you're running into like freedom and allowing people to do the right thing and make the right decision. I'd be open to suggestions too. I feel like that's kind of a tricky question because we have a huge influx of people moving into Arizona that maybe come from California and they're used to driving faster. So, I mean, there's no one fix it for everything. One size doesn't fit all. but I would definitely be open to talking to the voter that asked that question, and maybe they can give some suggestions and bring some insight to that. But I mean, it would be extremely challenging to try and enforce or police people to go the speed limit. But I do think we need to address the shortage in police officers in the community. I think that'll help kind of mitigate the issue.
All right. Got another question here about gun safety. Do you support red flag laws, and how are we going to prevent gun violence in Arizona? Mr. Carter.
To answer it kind of bluntly and shortly, I don't support red flag laws because I am concerned about the constitutional implications of red flag laws and the fact that you're taking away a fundamental right. So it is in our Constitution, whether you agree with that or not. It's in the federal Constitution, and that's the same as freedom of religion, freedom of speech and assembly. And if you are going to abridge a constitutional right because you claim that somebody shouldn't have something, you better make sure that you have an ironclad process for that. And we already do prohibit gun ownership to felons, for example. We have some of those things in place, but we have to be very careful when we start talking about fundamental rights, whether we're just accusing somebody of, being a little weird and then not being able to have a gun. So we have to be careful about that. It is a big problem, though, gun violence. And I think, honestly, if you look at it, it's been growing over, really, you might say, my lifetime. My father's generation, certainly the 50s and 60s, didn't have school shootings. It's something that started around Columbine and has only gotten worse. And I think it's a cultural thing. I think most of the people who are involved in school shootings are young people who are male and they are angry. I think that a lot of times it's really a kind of murder-suicide where they are hopeless. And so somehow we're creating a crisis among young men who are simultaneously enraged and hopeless. And that's part of the problem, a big part of the problem. So we need to start to look at our cultural fabric, at what we're doing as a culture, as a society, to build strong communities, build strong families, to make things affordable for families. There's a lot to this. But in the immediate kind of gun violence area, we have school resource officers, and we have been funding them. That's another thing. We're having a problem recruiting them because they can make more pay usually as policemen. So we are encouraging that. We are trying to make sure that every school is staffed with a school resource officer who can respond to shootings and be present there, and then also just be identifying threats and making friends with the students and knowing what's going on. So we're trying to be smart. And I would ask for your prayers and for our culture, and I guess that's kind of where we're at. I'm also open to suggestions on that too.
All right, Mr. Stovall.
Well, as a veteran, I've had friends die for that Second Amendment, so shall not be infringed at what it says. I do think that we do have an uptrend in gun violence because of the culture in our communities, but I think, like Representative Carter said, building strong communities, building awareness to what guns are, what they do, and how they can harm people is going to be important, especially with those RSO officers that are in the community schools, public schools, and private schools. But at the end of the day, it's a fundamental right. I get it. There's a lot of people that may have opinions about we should have tighter gun laws, tighter gun regulations. And I think it's just boosting awareness to what guns are capable of and just being an advocate in your community about gun violence. So I feel like that's a really sticky topic to try and run into because it is in our Second Amendment. So I personally can't say that I'm for red flag laws. I'm against red flag laws.
Is educating the community something you should happen through the state legislature? Is it a state responsibility at all?
I think the state legislator can be advocates for that, but I think that falls back into the community's responsibility. So working with their state legislators and working with the community leaders just to ensure that that information and that education is being relayed correctly.
I have a question in here. Should the Arizona government provide healthcare funds and resources to the indigenous / tribal communities? Since we're already on you, Mr. Stovall.
Yes. Simple answer to that is yes, we should. We should be.
All right, Mr. Carter.
The question is, should the Arizona government provide healthcare to the tribes?
Healthcare funds and resources to the tribes, yes.
I think no. I think that the federal government is primarily responsible for that. There is a Bureau of Indian Affairs, and in many ways, the tribal lands are sovereign. So even if we tried to do that, we would run afoul of a number of preemption laws and other things. But the real question to me is, do tribal members pay state taxes? And I can tell you, as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, they do not pay the sales tax. Businesses on tribal lands that are not tribally owned and who are making sales to people who do not pertain to the tribe do pay taxes, but the tribe itself does not. So there would be a real fairness, equity, or even a justice concern there, I think. You would be effectively creating a kind of a wealth transfer from one group of people to another. So I would be worried about that, and I don't think that that's our jurisdiction. Now,
Well, I mean, we can address that as we go. I do think it's a conversation that's worth being had.
I would say this, though, to the extent that we have problems with rural doctors and nurses, I know that that's a big problem. And to the extent that we can encourage healthcare professionals to settle in Arizona, to be incentivized to live in communities where we need them, absolutely. And that would have the spillover effect of helping a lot of the tribal lands, which are, let's be honest, usually in far-flung areas of greater Arizona. So in that sense, absolutely, we should be looking at that. But that's how I feel.
Did you want to elaborate on anything, Mr. Stovall?
Nope, I kind of chimed in with him. I do think it's a conversation that needs to be had. I don't know if it's the state's responsibility to do that. Kind of like Representative Carter said, you run into some jurisdiction, some legality with that. But I do think the conversation needs to be had.
This is coming out of left field since it's not on the list here, but what about Medicaid fraud? There's been an issue with Arizona and Access, which is our state Medicaid agency. They've announced that they've accidentally given out a lot to fraudulent providers. Is that something that the legislature should address, even though we're talking about this being largely a federal issue with tribal healthcare? I'll ask you, Representative Carter, since I know this is a bill that was at the legislature this year.
It's absolutely something we should eliminate fraud where there's fraud. Absolutely. As you know, the Access is administered by the state, and it really is a state agency, and the legislature ultimately is an oversight body. We vote to continue agencies, which is one nice thing about Arizona is that every agency sunsets. It means it goes away by law, and then we have to re-up or reapprove it. So that's absolutely, the legislature is at its high water mark with oversight, and that's exactly what we should do, I think.
And Mr. Stovall, I know you haven't dealt with the bill this year, but Medicaid fraud, if you want to get into it.
Fraud is bad. I mean, I don't really think I need to elaborate too much on that. And if there is fraud that's taking place, the legislators and the leaders need to do something about it to address it and ensure it's not happening and that it never happens. As you mentioned, I haven't seen any bills. I haven't been a part of the bills, but I do think that, yeah, we got to nip that in the bud. That there's no way that should be slipping through the cracks.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that might not be a problem next year, hopefully, but probably will be, is budget shortfalls. If we have to make cuts in the budget, how are we going to do that? Or is it even a problem that we have a smaller budget that we have in years past? And we'll start with you, Mr. Carter.
The state budget in 2009 or 10, so not that long ago, was less than 10 billion. The budget that we passed 2 years ago was the biggest ever. It was about 18 billion. And then this year, like I say, we shrunk it a little, so it's something like 17 something, but that's almost double mean, stop and think about that. In 10 years, I mean, this is like a 10% budget growth year over year. I think the budget's been kind of ballooning over the last several sessions. And after all, if I told you, if you were in business, you put government aside, if you're in business, and I said your business is going to make 10% more than it did last year, every single year for 10 years. So you're going to make 100% more in 10 years. But then on the 11th year, we're going to ask you to cut back 10%. You're still making 90% more than you were 10 years ago. Of course, you're going to sign up for that program. So, of course, the budget is cyclical. There's times when we need to cut back. I think it offers an opportunity, frankly. I think it means that things are scrutinized better and we have an opportunity to really take a hard look at some of the programs and whether they're working. That's one thing. And if the program's been working for 10 years, it's one thing. But if it's not, it's an opportunity to reallocate the funds. We need to be responsible. It's not our money. It's your money. The government takes it from you and from me and from Mr. Stovall, from all of us, right? The money's taken and then supposed to be spent responsibly. So I don't see it as the budget shrinking necessarily is a bad thing. But did that answer the question?
Oh yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
Mr. Stovall, saying back to you, is the budget shortfall a problem? We're making cuts and the budget has up until now been growing quite a bit.
Yeah, we have a serious spending problem. I looked at the appropriations bill or the appropriations book for 2020 or 2022, and it's pretty incredible to see how we keep funding programs and giving money to programs. And those programs aren't really producing more as they raise the budget. So I'd really like to do a deep dive and see where the money's being allocated. If it's not being allocated correctly, how do we go about reallocating it? What are the ramifications for that? Because we're spending more, but we're not seeing a significant improvement in certain areas. So that's my biggest concern. More specifically with the veterans, we see a lot of money going to the veteran organizations or the VA, but we don't see any money being allocated for suicide prevention. There's $0 being allocated to that. So that's really concerning to me. That's one of the things I've been kind of championing for my campaign this upcoming election is just bringing awareness to that. We're sending tons of money to this body, right? The VA, but we're not really seeing them steward that money well. And that kind of caveats to what Representative Carter said. We need to figure out how we go about reallocating this funding if it's not being appropriated correctly. So it's a huge concern of mine. I'm not sure how many people are aware of the money that's going to the VA in the state and how it's being mismanaged, but it's really concerning to me to see just how poorly we've managed the budget the last 10 years.
I am curious to know what your priority would be as a lawmaker. What would be the one bill or the one topic that you would most want to focus on that's the most important to you, Mr. Stovall?
I would say it's definitely going to be veterans in the community and school choice. School choice impacted my life significantly. As many people know, I moved 57 times in the state of Arizona. I went to a lot of the high schools all over the valley. So I'm very familiar with the communities and the impacts that it has if the money's not allocated correctly for like retention programs for students that maybe are troubled. I was one of those kids that was kind of lagging in my high school years. So that and veterans is going to be my main focus, just making sure that we're taking care of our veterans and more importantly, our veteran families. So maybe talking more about reciprocity bills for veterans that are PCSing and veterans that are being integrated back into the community and just mental health and mental awareness overall. So that's one of the things I'm really focused on.
Thank you. Representative Carter, priorities?
I'm really glad that Stovall mentioned school choice. In Arizona, we have a Parents' Bill of Rights. Parents raise children. The government doesn't raise children. And absolutely, we should have school choice. That's what I think is a big thing. So preserving that is big. You already know some of my priorities: shrinking the budget, reducing the tax burden, are obviously important. Another thing that I find though that we haven't talked about yet, actually, is transportation. In our district, transportation problem, right? We need to be funding roads, maintenance, State Route 24, the Canal Parkway, all of these things, that should be a priority too. And that's another big priority.
Yeah, I'd really like to see what we could do or how we go about getting that $87 million back to kind of developing the rest of the 24. I think that should be a huge focus of whoever gets
Yeah.
elected in the upcoming
We
election.
will. We will. Over my dead body, we'll lose it. Mr. Stovall is referring, in case anyone isn't aware of it, the legislature funded 87, I think 87 and a half, but anyway,
87 and a half.
Yeah, million for the continuation of State Route 24, which is of vital importance to the state, for a lot of reasons. I could elaborate on that, but for interest of time, I won't. And that money has not been released by the governor yet. So we are definitely looking at what's going on with that.
Is that bill dead in the water, or did she veto that?
No, it's already been passed. It was part of last year's budget. So the money, it's already the law right, in the budget that was passed last year that it's supposed to be released. We're still in this current fiscal year until the end of June. So in theory, she has up to June 30th to release that money. What she's trying to do is to claw it back in the current budget, but that would require us to pass a budget that does that. And I've already told legislative leadership and the appropriations chairman, I'm not voting for a budget that's going to claw back our highway money. So you're gonna have to pass such a budget without me anyway. And that I'm on record on that. And that's something, yeah, that's important.
I guess we'll find out soon in the coming weeks. Would you support a budget that cuts back highway money for other highways that are not that highway?
I think it's up to individual members to advocate for what's important in their district. I know that Representative Martinez and Casa Grande will not support a budget that would claw back the money for Casa Grande, which I think is 347 or something, and I-10 and so on. And that's the way I see it. It comes down to individual district priorities. I can see a world where maybe in your district you have some highway funding, but that's not as big of a priority for you as something else, but so I can't really speak for the other districts, but for our district, we both live here, we all live here, and I know Mr. Stovall would agree. The traffic situation here is terrible.
It's a nightmare, especially if commuting. We have a lot of commuters in our community that commute to Phoenix or Tempe, and this highway it's a headache. And I mean, that's one of the main things. And when I've knocked doors, I can't speak for Representative Carter, but that's one of the main things that people have complained about. What are we doing about this 24? How can I ensure that I can get to my kids' soccer games in time and make it home to spend time with them? So that's a big focus, and that's something I'm going to be fighting for.
All right, I'll squeeze in one last transportation question before we have to go. Should we be paying more to public transit? That was the big fight last year with Proposition 400's extension, and transportation funding is how much of the honeypot, shall we say, should go towards public transportation, more or less? Representative Carter.
So I believe what you're referring to is the extension, the half-cent sales tax extension in Maricopa County, which initially was enacted in 1984.
Yes.
And it was enacted to pay for freeways. And it did pay for freeways, and it built the 101 and the 202. And that's what the voters wanted. But it was a 20-year tax, so they re-upped it in 2004. But then it went not just to freeways, but to arterial streets, which meant it shifted some of the funding from the cities away to the state tax, and then also to light rail. And now they're looking at passing it this year, substantially the same, I think, but it does include some light rail and stuff. Now, this was a big debate at the legislature. And I had voted no on continuing that tax, partially, not entirely, but partially because, well, for one thing, it's a tax. The voters are asking us to be more responsible with their money and live within our means and not try to pass a tax extension is one thing. But even if we did do a tax extension, which I think is stupid, I think most of the voters want the freeways and the roads. at least in my district. And there is no bus service in Pinal, but that's a conversation we could have. But then it's like you said, who should pay for it? So I had voted no on the original version, and we came up with a compromise, which I voted yes on. And we were going to split the question into two and have two separate ballot initiatives. One, instead of a half-cent sales tax for roads and public transit, we were going to do a 0.3, so 0.3 of a cent for roads, and a 0.2 for transit, and then leave it up to the voters. The voters want both, they'd have both. If they want one, they'll have one. They want the other, they'll have the other. I believe in empowering the voters to make that choice. And that was vetoed by the governor. So the initiative now, we're back to a half-cent that includes roads and transit. And I think that's the wrong way to go. So I voted no on that, but it passed anyway.
Right.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I just running low on time. Mr. Stovall, if it ever becomes a topic at the legislature again, the issue of public transportation, more or less funding towards that.
I think it goes back to my original statement where I said just reallocation of funding. We have more than enough money. The legislator had, kind of like Representative Carter said, there was a bill that was pushed and it got vetoed. So maybe we revisit that and figure out exactly why it was vetoed. And going back to what I said, again, looking at the bill in its entirety and seeing what needs to be ripped out of it and what can we add to it, what can we amend. Those discussions need to be had. I don't know what bill Representative Carter is referring to, but I would be curious, and I'm going to look that up when we finish this call to see exactly why it was vetoed. But it's ultimately up to the voters. What the voters want, we're supposed to ensure that that gets carried out at the legislature. So,
right.
But I'm not in favor of raising taxes. Let's make that clear.
Okay. Got it. Well, it's time for your closing statement. And since we started off with Representative Carter, we're going to start off with you this time, Mr. Stovall.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, once again, my name is Alex Stovall. I'm a veteran, I'm a conservative, I'm a husband, and I'm a believer in the community, just wanting to build bridges where they've been burned and destroyed. I want to be an advocate for the next generation and an advocate for the people in my community, the community that I grew up in. I think there's a lot that I can bring from experience in my military background with logistics and understanding numbers. And I understand how important freedom is, and I understand many have paid the ultimate price for it. And I just want to fight and work serve at another capacity. And this is one way to do it. So if that's what you're looking for a fresh face, a fresh voice to bring new ideas to the party and ensure that conservative values are carried out for the next 30 years, then I'm your guy. So I look forward to serving my community.
Thank you. Representative Carter?
I'll keep it brief. My name is Neil Carter. I've been a Santan Valley homeowner for 15 years. I have a young daughter, and as a young family and another one on the way, as a young family myself, I know that what's most important right now is that we are being crunched by inflation. Costs are out of control. We talked a little bit about rents and about other things. And in the last 3 years, we've managed to eliminate some of the taxes on rents, for example. We also eliminated the state part of the property tax 3 years ago, which I was in favor of. And so I would just say, if you support fiscal accountability, responsibility, you want to see a responsible state, not to slash and burn. We're still going to be fully funding police. We're still looking out for school choice, for funding education, and so on. But allocating monies responsibly, I think my track record speaks for itself. I'm also very conservative. I have a 100% score with the CPAC, with the American Conservative Union, and 100% scores with the Republican Liberty Caucus and Arizona Free Enterprise Club. So I think my record speaks for itself. Just quickly remember, you do get to vote for two. So you have two representatives, and two will serve, and you have the opportunity to vote for two. So I would ask for your vote. Neil Carter for House. I appreciate everyone who's attended.
All right, thank you so much. This concludes our debate. To our candidates, we thank you so much for participating. And to the voters, we thank all of you who took the time to watch the debate and inform yourselves before the July 30th primary election. We encourage you to visit azcleanelections.gov for official, accurate voting information.
Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
And I'm
Thank
assuming
you.
this is going to be posted somewhere.